Welcome in, Minnesota sports fans, to another edition of Timberwolves on SI right here on the Bring Me the Sports YouTube channel. Jonathan Harrison here, joined once again by Joe Nelson, Will Ragatz, Tony Liebert, and we are once again discussing the Timberwolves trade now that it's officially finalized. Karl-Anthony Towns heading to the New York Knicks in exchange for Julius Randle, Dante DiVincenzo, Keita Bates-Diop, and a future first-round pick via the Detroit Pistons. A couple things going to the Charlotte Hornets as well as part of the trade. But, Joe, we got your immediate take, Friday night when the trade was breaking. So, Will, Tony, I want your guys' reactions to this trade now that it's officially finalized. But before we get that, do want to remind people who are watching here on the Bring Me the Sports YouTube channel, do hit the subscribe button. It does help us get found. Also lets you know when we post a new video about Minnesota sports. So go hit that, and Will, take it away.
Yeah, this is one of the more surprising trades, I think, in all of Minnesota sports in a long time. And the fact that it came through late on a Friday night was just stunning. But now official 5 days later, having had some time to process it, I don't know if it's my tendency to talk myself into things and be optimistic, but I really like the trade, and I understand why Tim Connolly and the Wolves made this move. And I think a lot of people were upset about losing Cat, and I think that's fair given what he's meant to this team and this community for the last 9 years, and the fact that he's a very good basketball player. But there's a lot of reasons to me why doing this move now, as surprising as the timing was, makes sense, because you're selling high on a guy who's 29 years old, who has missed some time with injuries the last couple of years, who is set to make, and this is the key part, $220 million over the next 4 seasons. And that just really ties you up from a cap, from a books standpoint. This gives the Wolves more flexibility moving forward financially to, build around the Ant and Naz Reid and Jaden McDaniels and now Dante DiVincenzo, who we'll talk about, that kind of core with a window that is extending long beyond this Ant, Cat, Rudy trio that we saw get to the Western Conference Finals last year. So I just think from a selling high now, it's always going to feel weird when you sell high on something in anything, in fantasy football, in any sports league, whatever it may be. But if Cat had gotten injured again or something, maybe hadn't played as well, if this fit just clearly wasn't working next year with Rudy, like, it just would have gotten harder to trade him and harder to get back what they did get back in this trade. And I think they got quite a bit back. Julius Randle is, he's a polarizing player, but you look at his numbers, he's made as many All-NBA teams as Karl-Anthony Towns. He puts up similar numbers. He's nowhere near the shooter, bit more of a playmaker, more of a bully inside, driving to the rim, things like that. So I don't know how long he'll be a part of the Wolves' future, but in the short term, he can help replace the production. And then I think the Dante DiVincenzo piece, I mean, the contract that he's on, making $36 million total over the next 3 seasons, one of the best contracts in the NBA. Maybe that first round pick that's protected from Detroit, maybe that means something here too down the line. But I just think the Wolves increase their financial flexibility moving forward while not taking a massive step back, or maybe any sort of step back for the 24-25 season. Because you look at it now, and they might have the deepest bench in the NBA with DiVincenzo joining Naz Reid and Nikhil and those guys. So I'm in on the trade. I trust Tim Connolly. I believe in him. The Rudy Gobert thing was criticized. That seems to have worked out. He trades for Mike Conley. That worked brilliantly. So I'm in on it, and I'm excited to see what happens this season.
Tony?
Yeah. My main takeaway is long term. I think it's a really good deal. I think it extends the Wolves' window, and like Will mentioned, that first round pick could turn into something good. Dante DiVincenzo on a great contract, but I guess I'll play devil's advocate. And I just don't really love Julius Randle's fit on the team in the short term. So I guess from my perspective, if they are open to not like feeling the need to rely on Julius Randle and they almost open up the Naz Reid minutes a little bit more, I would like the deal. But since they traded this big franchise cornerstone with Cat and they feel the need to like keep playing Julius Randle, I could see some things going wrong because his fit next to Gobert is just odd to me. And I just think it could be clunky to start. And it kind of seemed like it was finally starting to click with everything last season. So in the short term, I still have a lot of questions. Um, but it does make them one of the deepest teams in the NBA. And they have probably the best 7-man rotation in the NBA. But now another aspect is how many more minutes are going to be left for the rookies that you took in the first round. Because DiVincenzo and Naz Reid, let's say you're seventh and eighth men. Joe Ingles, you signed to a free agent contract. He's probably in the mix there somewhere. And then you have Rob Dillingham and Terrence Shannon Jr. that you're going to want to develop and play these minutes. I don't know how much time I guess they'll play this year. A lot of people thought they could maybe be in the rotation, so that's an interesting aspect to all of this, adding an extra body into the mix. But my main takeaways is it extends the Wolves' window, I think, by a pretty wide margin, and in the short term, I think it could look a little clunky.
Yeah, I think this is a win now move. Obviously, I think you're deeper. You were the deepest team in the NBA, arguably last season. Maybe Boston had said something to say about that, but this was a team that went 9-10 deep on most nights. Now you're even deeper. Tony, you wrote a story about it, how they have 7 guys in the Ringers top 100 now. It's phenomenal. DiVincenzo started 63 games until Michael Bridges got to New York last season. Then he found a spot on the bench, but he's still a guy who went for 23, 25, 28, 35, and 39 points in a bunch of playoff games for a Knicks team that did not have Julius Randle, who was out after late January, suffering a pretty bad injury. So my feelings on this personally, my gut says Julius Randle's not part of the long-term plan. He's signed through this season. He's part of the recipe this season. I wouldn't be shocked if Minnesota spins him for something else this season if they feel Naz Reid can step into that starting role and really be a gunner. You look at the per 36 minutes, Naz Reid and Karl-Anthony Towns are essentially clones. And Naz Reid is playing on a $15 million deal. He's going to get paid a lot of money. That $31 million player option that Julius Randle has next season, that's nothing. The guy's averaged 24 and 10 and 5, 4 straight seasons essentially, and he's young enough and a 3-time All-Star. He's going to get a lot more than $31 million a year as these TV contracts and player contracts escalate. I just don't see there's any way in the world where he says, yeah, I want that $31 million to be in Minnesota. I don't think it's happening. I don't think this was part of the long-term plan at all for Minnesota. This was a move to facilitate space for Naz Reid in the big picture. And I wouldn't be shocked if Randle gets traded this season. And if not this season, then certainly after this season.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. To just jump off of that like, yeah, the Julius Randle thing, to Tony's point, it's an interesting fit. Because he's not much of a shooter, and you're putting him next to Gobert. If your starting lineup, your front court is Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, Rudy Gobert, there's not a whole lot of shooting there to complement Ant and Conley, and that's where I think you could see, Naz Reid and Dante DiVincenzo, even if they don't start, being in a lot of your closing lineups for the floor spacing element. With that said, I think Randle and McDaniels can both shoot from the corners. If you look at their career percentages, which is something that's helpful, but it's less about Julius Randle. If you're ranking all of the aspects of this trade, getting Randle isn't the top 1 or the top 2 or maybe the top 3. That's part of it because of what his proven scoring and what he can give you in the short term. But like Joe said, that might be a 1-year deal with Randle, and he might be gone. He could be gone before that season ends. It's more about the financial flexibility, getting DiVincenzo, and what it means for Naz Reid. I mean, that you brought it up. That's a huge part of this, is they really believe in Naz Reid and the sustainability of his breakout season last year, winning 6th Man of the Year. I've thought it for a while that Naz Reid gives you a lot of what Karl-Anthony Towns gives you at a fraction of the price, without some of the other things that Towns brings. And Towns is a better player, to be clear. But the offensive fouls and some of the haywire over-the-shoulder passes and just some of those things that Towns also brought, I think they really wanted to keep Naz Reid. And by doing this, they should be able to get him signed again next year and keep guys like Nickeil Alexander-Walker as well. I just think that this move, as clunky as the Randle thing might be, that part of it isn't huge. The part of it that matters is the long-term flexibility and then the window here and what it means for with getting Dante DiVincenzo and Naz Reid to anchor your bench now and maybe be starters in the future.
Yeah, I mean, that was very well said by Will, because, like, almost from my opinion, if you take Julius Randle out of the Wolves, like, I don't think their outlook really would change that much. And I think it would almost be more fluid, in all honesty. And my just main concern is that he might just mess things up a little bit because his fit is weird, depending on how many lineups they have with McDaniels, Randle, and Gobert, because let's say Naz Reid starts most of the games. I would love this move if you play Julius Randle 25 minutes off the bench or something like that. Just throwing a random number out there. But I just think he could take too many things away from everyone else. And, like, he is a good player and he's an asset that you're going to want if you're giving someone up like Towns. But there are just a few things in his game that in the short term, in this 1 year, that in the postseason and high pressure moments, I don't I guess I wouldn't want him to take things away from those other players. But there's so many positives to take from the deal, like DiVincenzo, like getting Naz Reid more minutes, a bigger role, the opportunity to re-sign him. The Randall fit is the biggest question for me. I think there's a lot of ways it could go, and if they play it right, I think this could be a great deal. And there's no reason to believe they won't, because Tim Connolly has a track record of knowing what he's doing.
So let me
Can I
ask you,
say something on Randall real quick? Just I understand that perspective for sure, and I think I've seen that from a lot of Wolves fans, and Knicks fans weren't the biggest Randall advocates by the end of his tenure there, but I think he's almost being overlooked a little bit in this whole thing because of maybe the perception of who he is, and I think there's some of that with Cat as well outside of Minnesota, maybe playoff things or personality or style of play, whatever it may be, but. Julius Randle, you look at the numbers, and he's a 3-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA, 25, 10, and 5 at his best. And I just think, yes, it's a little awkward that he's kind of a ball stopper and an ISO guy when the Wolves already have that and Anthony Edwards. How those two are going to play together will be interesting. But to me, Randall's coming in here. He knows that this is not his team. He knows this is Anthony Edwards' team. He's in a contract year. He wants to get paid next offseason. He sees what the Wolves did last year. I think he'll be motivated to find a way to fit in. And I mean, it's probably going to be starting given his track record, but maybe he comes off the bench for Naz Reid at some point. And I just think if he's playing in his role of scorer, rebounder, defense, providing some playmaking, not being as much of an ISO ball stopper, and letting Anthony Edwards do that more than him at least, then I think the fit could work out, and it's up to Chris Finch, who has coached, by the way, Julius Randle in New Orleans, to figure out how to make those pieces work.
So let me ask you this, guys, since it seems like there's some questions on how this will all fit together with Randle and DiVincenzo in the lineup. Does this trade signal that the expectations are raised? Because Joe said it's a win-now move. You guys seem to have agreed on that. Does this raise expectations for the season? Are they better off, worse off, or is it kind of just a push at this point? Joe, I'll start with you.
I think they're better off. I really do believe that. This depth is going to matter in one of the best Western conferences that we're anticipating seeing in years. I mean, this is a very deep conference. Even San Antonio could make a giant leap with Victor Wembanyama this season. A lot of guys are coming back who were hurt last season. Klay Thompson's in Dallas. We've seen so many shakeups and so many things happen over the course of this offseason that there's a lot of unknowns, but the one thing we do know is that it is deep and it's a grind. I know when we saw the Timberwolves schedule come out, you're like, man, there's really no soft spots. There's not. I mean, but you got to think of it, if you're the Minnesota Timberwolves, from the perspective of, well, everybody else sees us on the schedule and they get a little bit nervous. The most exciting thing about this for me is lineup combinations. When you have this kind of depth, and you have an older point guard like Mike Conley, and your backup is a rookie Rob Dillingham, you don't want to rush Dillingham into the fire. And that's where DiVincenzo becomes so key, because he can play point guard. Anthony Edwards can play point guard. They could have both of those guys on the floor at the same time, interchangeable, whoever has the ball brings it up the court. But think about this, guys. Let's say you go DiVincenzo as your lead ball handler, Ant at the 2, Julius Randle Mitch Kupchak, when the Lakers had Julius Randle there, he was like, yes, this guy can bring the ball up the floor as well. We don't think he's a 3 on offense, but he can defend small forwards. So you've got Randle on the floor, and then you could go Naz Reid and Rudy Gobert. You would have an ultimate defensive lineup right there. All 5 guys, outside of Naz to some extent, obviously, would be very good defenders. And if you don't want to go with Julius Randle on the floor, or let's say you don't want to go with Rudy Gobert on the floor, why don't you try on for size DiVincenzo with Ant, Jaden McDaniels, Julius Randle, and Naz? That's nasty, you guys. So Randle and Jaden are kind of interchangeable about who can guard the 3 and the 4. Ant and DiVincenzo are interchangeable about who can guard the 1 and the 2. Gobert and Naz are flexible in the roles that they have. We've already heard some gloating about, like, not gloating, but some promising comments from Chris Finch and company about how Josh Minot's taken a leap this summer. Leonard Miller's taken a leap this summer. Some of these guys like Terrence Shannon, we don't know what kind of impact they're going to have. Haven't even mentioned Joe Ingles yet, who can bring the ball up the floor. So the number of lineup combinations that the Timberwolves are going to be able to work with, and Chris Finch seems to be the master of deploying, is really unmatched. And that's going to be a big-time challenge on any given night when the Timberwolves go up against a team like Boston, when they need to go small, or if they go up against a team that's bigger and they want to go big. They have every component necessary to battle any team that comes their way.
Yeah, it's a great point that you make on their depth, which is just ridiculous. I mean, Dillingham and Shannon, and you go down to the Josh Minot, Leonard Miller.
I didn't even say Nickeil Alexander-Walker.
Luka Garza. Exactly. Nikhil's going to be in the rotation. He's a great defender who's a great shooter up until some stretches of the playoffs. Like, the depth of this team is ridiculous. The combinations and the chess pieces for Chris Finch and his staff to work with are really remarkable. And I think, early on in the season, we could see maybe some kind of inconsistency and some growing pains as they just try to integrate these new guys. But Randle in particular, because I think DiVincenzo as a great defender and a 40% high volume shooter will be just a seamless fit in any offense.
Yeah.
But as they try to work the pieces together, they could struggle a little bit on offense early on. I think the defense that with Gobert and McDaniels and Ant and all those guys will be elite right away. But I don't know. I think generally, to Jonathan's question, like, my expectations for the season, I'd say they've kind of remained neutral, and it's hard for them to go much higher than coming off 56 wins in a Western Conference Finals. But I can't say that they're lower, because I personally wasn't the biggest fan of the Cat Rudy fit long term, and some of the things I've mentioned that I loved Cat watching him play. He's a great person. Great player, but just some of the complaining to refs and the flailing his arms and committing dumb foul after dumb foul, it just wasn't my favorite thing at times. And so I think there's some real exciting possibilities here. The Randall piece being what it is, but with Naz Reid and with Dante DiVincenzo and Jaden and Ant, Conley, just Nickeil, the depth of this team, like, they are built to adapt to whatever teams want to do against them, and they're built to survive an injury or two with this depth over the course of a long NBA season. So I think this is going to be a really fun year, and I think their ceiling is just as high as it was before the trade, if not potentially higher, if they figure out how to make everything work well.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with that to a point. It just, when you hear all the depth, it's obviously like you can go 12 deep and you're like, all of these guys are rotation players in the NBA, and there's not many, if any, other team in the NBA that can say that. But I do think there's like a point on any team, especially in the NBA, when you're dealing with full-grown men, that it's their careers, that you could have too many cooks in the kitchen sometimes. There's no reason to believe that Chris Finch won't be able to figure it out, because he's shown that he's one of the best coaches in the NBA, and his players trust him, and he figured it out with Cat and Rudy, and not many people thought that he could have done that. So there's no reason to think he can't figure this out, but it's a good problem to have all those options. If there's one injury, they're going to be able to change a lot of things up. But I think there is a point where you have too many options, and I could see a point where early in the season this team does kind of struggle because they're trying to figure out what lineup works the best, because they kind of figured out what worked the best last year, and now it's something completely new. So I think there could be a situation where this team ends up as a 4 or 5 seed maybe heading into the playoffs. But I think they'll still be well above the play-in tournament. And I think the expectations once we get to the postseason will be the same, at least for me. But I think early in the year we could maybe see a slower start.
Take this question however you guys want. There's no stipulations on it. Who's the biggest winner and who's the biggest loser of this trade? Joe, I'll start with you.
Ooh, man, that's a really good question. I think the biggest loser of this trade is Nickeil Alexander-Walker. He carved out such a brilliant role last season for this team, and I'm sitting here looking at it like, okay, when the Wolves traded Cat, John Krasinski came out with the report, which kind of corroborated some of my personal thoughts last summer before this Cat trade even happened. In my opinion, it was like, you have to trade Cat now if you want to have the best chance to sign Naz Reid and Nickeil Alexander-Walker to the long term. Nickeil is a flat-out free agent after the season. He's making like $4 million, right? He's going to get paid a lot more. He was so good last year that some team's going to look at him and say he could be in our starting lineup. So right now, he's been bumped backwards because DiVincenzo is here. Unless this team's like rolling out 20-minute-a-night game plans and they're really saving bodies for the long run. I think Na got backed up on this one. And then the odds of the Timberwolves actually re-signing him if they don't move Julius Randle or Rudy Gobert or somebody else in this top 8-9 to carve out a bigger role and still a backup role, Na's probably the odd man out because DiVincenzo's on that brilliant contract, like Will mentioned. So I think Na is the biggest loser. The biggest winner, probably Cat. I mean, he gets to go back to New York. He's from New Jersey. But more importantly, he gets to be a 5 again. You know, the sacrifices that he made to switch to power forward and change his game and have to defend 4s, guys who are generally smaller and quicker than him, he did that, and he did a pretty good job of that. Now he gets to go back and be a 5 in the Eastern Conference and play with an elite point guard in Jalen Brunson and a really good starting 5, which we've all seen the commentary so far. And I agree, the Knicks on paper have the best starting 5 in the NBA, even better than Minnesota's. I mean, it's very, very good with Michael Bridges and Jalen Brunson and Karl-Anthony Towns and Josh Hart, and I'm forgetting somebody else, but he's good, right? Like, these guys can roll. So now he gets to be a 5 and go back to being the best scoring 5 in the league, maybe outside of Nikola Jokic. And he gets to be put on display in a market that's really going to put the light on him. It has some crash potential for sure if he doesn't play well. Like Jeff Teague said on his podcast, if you play like ass, they're going to burn you down in New York. And that's something that can happen to Karl-Anthony Towns every now and again. But he's got a chance to shine here, guys. He really does, on a very good team that probably should have been in the conference finals last season without Julius Randle. So they ran into Indiana. Indiana was hot in the conference semifinals. That's a good team, man. And they're only going to be better this year, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd say I have a couple winners stand out. I think Jalen Brunson is a winner of all this because of the spacing that Cat's going to provide. And I just think, I mean, we saw Brunson really kind of over the last couple of years, last year's playoffs in particular, just take a wild leap to becoming one of the best players in the NBA and a legitimate MVP candidate. And I think adding Cat only will help that because of the spacing. And Randall is going to have all kinds of room to operate. I think that pick and pop with Cat, with the two of them, is going to be pretty lethal. And then I'd say the other winner that jumps out at me is Naz Reid. Because this moving Cat, who was a very similar style of play to him, similar position, it just clears the runway for the continued ascension, the continued takeoff of flight number 11, Naz Reid, who has just become a fan favorite for his style of play and his personality and all those things, but I think has legitimate like star potential. If you tell me Naz Reid's going to make an All-Star game in the NBA someday, I wouldn't be shocked just because of how far he's already come from, being a little bit of an overweight center coming out of LSU, undrafted, to sixth man of the year, and just all the per 36 things that he's done in this league. The runway is now there. This massive cat contract and playing time and all-star is gone, and maybe it'll be one more year of coming off the bench as the sixth man behind Randall, but I don't think Randall is going to be a long-term part of the Wolves' future. It's eventually going to be Naz Reid. I think that's their plan. So I think Naz is a big winner in this. As far as losers, I don't know. You can argue it either way. You could say either team, or I like the Nickeil Alexander-Walker pick from Joe just because of what Dante's arrival will mean for him. But I think it's the Knicks. I don't know. I'm worried about their ceiling, and I know I just praised Brunson and the fit there, but I'm worried about their legitimate title ceiling, and then what having to pay Karl-Anthony Towns $220 million over the next 4 years could mean for them in the short-term future.
Yeah, they don't have any depth. That's one thing. The guy I forgot, by the way, is OG Anunoby, who's high-end as well, small forward for the Knicks. But you look at the backups, they lost Isaiah Hartenstein to the Oklahoma City Thunder, who everyone likes as the top pick in the Western Conference this season. But for the most part, I mean, they don't have any depth, and that could be a big-time issue for the Knicks this season.
Well, it's not like Tom Thibodeau likes to use his depth to begin with, so just kind of fits his system.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's true. He runs 7 guys.
Yeah, I guess going third in this segment, you guys kind of took all of mine. I was going to say my winner was Naz Reid. I could, like Will said, I could see a scenario where he could maybe even become the second best player on this Wolves team. I think he has real all-star potential. I think we saw that last year. And to Joe's point as well, I think Nickeil Alexander-Walker is kind of the guy who gets lost in all of this. We saw his potential so much in the postseason last year, and now when you kind of talk about all the depth that this team has, he's kind of the guy you kind of forget to mention. And you're like, oh, shoot, he was still on this team. And I just don't know where those minutes are going to be. But the thing that we keep talking about is the depth. If this team has – they really can sustain any injury to the whole roster except for maybe Anthony Edwards, which no one can sustain an injury to a player like that. Something to Mike Conley would also be interesting too with the whole point guard aspect, but they just have so many guys you can just plug into everywhere, and it's just a very fascinating deal. The Randall thing's it's going to be interesting for my opinion because he's just the Gobert fit was weird too. So I don't know. They clearly see something that they like, but it'll be interesting.
So then, last question on this. What's Karl-Anthony Towns' legacy here in Minnesota? 9 seasons. Obviously came in at a down point. Battled through a lot here in Minnesota. 4-time All-Star, 2-time All-NBA, Rookie of the Year. Only leaving at 28. What's his legacy in Minnesota, Joe?
Nice guys finish last. That's his legacy. And I mean that in the nicest way possible. He's a tremendous human being, right? Like, everything about him is high-end quality. But he never took this team where it needed to go. And some of that's unfair because he was a number 1 overall pick in the draft, and he's a big guy. And he came to an organization that was a failure, a complete and utter failure that did nothing but damage him by moving pieces who were really good, like Zach LaVine, for locker room cancers like Jimmy Butler. So, he's a nice guy. He got put into the wrong situation. I mean, we talk so much about the Vikings and Sam Darnold, and where you go dictates your legacy and your success. Unfortunately, he got drafted by the Minnesota Timberwolves at the wrong time. If he gets drafted number 1 overall by the Timberwolves in 2019, and then Ant comes in the next season, you're talking about a whole different ball game, an entirely different story. I just think it's kind of unfortunate. I mean, imagine if like a guy like Greg Popovich got his hands on Karl-Anthony Towns in his early days. He would have built around him. And he would have been fantastic, and he probably would have had more playoff success. If Eric Spoelstra or Steve Kerr, any of these guys, these organizations, get their hands on a player of that level, because make no mistake, there aren't many Karl-Anthony Townses. There's there's only one other really in the NBA right now, and that's Victor Wembanyama, who's on his own level, right? There aren't 7-footers who do what Cat does. It's just unfortunate that he landed in Minnesota, and it stunted his career. I am hopeful on a selfish level that he has the ultimate success wherever he is in the future, New York this season and beyond, who knows?
Yeah, it's definitely interesting because, like what Will mentioned, I think anyone who watches the Timberwolves often goes through periods, especially and during Cat's time here, that you're like, oh, you just get really frustrated watching him because he has these moments that you're like, what are you doing? And you yell at the TV and you're like, this is super annoying. But like Joe said too, there's so much stuff that he's just an amazing human being. And when he does well, he's easy to root for. And it just lots of ups and downs with Cat. Like the rookie of the year, he's this great cornerstone that the franchise is going to build around. And then you see so many people online. He gets so much hate for the way he acts and all this stuff. And then as someone who's like a fan of Minnesota sports, you want to defend him. And then he does this stuff where he flails all over the court that it's hard to defend. So as someone who watches a lot of Timberwolves basketball, I think anyone that has and went through watching the career of Cat, you kind of go through a time that you're a huge fan, and then you're like, man, this guy stinks, and then you're a huge fan. But Cat the person, like Joe said, wonderful guy. And I think what stinks about it is I feel like this year everyone was really – Minnesota really, really got around Cat, and they're like, he's our weirdo almost.
Who are you, Tim Walls?
Yeah. But yeah, he will go down. Right now, he's one of the three best Timberwolves players of all time, maybe.
Oh, God, yeah. Easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right, good stuff from you guys. Certainly an interesting move for the Timberwolves with the season really right at the doorstep here. Season starting at the end of this month. Looking forward to it, how this all fits together. Again, if you're watching, appreciate it. Hit the subscribe button. Does help us get found. Also, it does notify you every time we do post a new Minnesota sports video. Also hit the like button. Does help the metrics here as well. But we'll be back tomorrow. Will and I will be breaking down the 5 key matchups for the game in London for the Vikings versus the Jets this weekend. I'm sure there's plenty to discuss there. And then Friday we'll be back with predictions for that game. We all got to make our predictions, get them in, get them ready for that as well. But boys, fun to talk to you, and Minnesota sports fans will be right back here tomorrow. Talk to you then.